I've always been uneasy around the idea of inheritance. Not because of the money itself, but because of what happens when silence meets entitlement. I've seen fortunes framed as permanence, spoken about as if they were immune to decay. But nothing about money is permanent once it passes into human hands. What unsettled me wasn't how fast wealth could be built, but how casually it could be undone. Often without drama, without malice, just through access. Too much of it, too soon. When I started paying attention, it became clear that wealth rarely disappears in explosions. It erodes, quietly, one person at a time. Families talk about recessions and crashes, but behind closed doors, the real damage usually has a name. A son, a daughter, a spouse. Someone who didn't create the engine, but was handed the keys anyway. I felt the tension in those rooms, the careful pauses when money came up, the awareness that one wrong decision wouldn't just affect a balance sheet, but decades of accumulated momentum. The most dangerous moment in the life of a fortune is when it meets human nature head-on. I've watched what happens when a young adult suddenly gains access to more money than experience. It changes the scale of everything. Normal becomes extravagant, extravagant becomes baseline, and once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. The spending isn't reckless in the obvious sense. It's justified, rationalized. Life simply expands to fill the available resources, and then demands more. Burn rate is the quiet killer. Not the first purchase, but the normalization of it. The house that felt excessive becomes home. The flights that once felt indulgent become expected. Staff appear, then feel indispensable. And when comfort becomes non-negotiable, the math stops working. The wealth may still look intact on paper, but its flexibility is gone. It can no longer adapt. It must now sustain a lifestyle that assumes the future will always cooperate. Then there are partners. I've seen how quickly things unravel when wealth meets someone who didn't grow up around it, didn't respect its fragility, or worse, felt entitled to it. You don't need a dramatic betrayal. You don't even need bad intentions. All it takes is legal proximity, marriage, shared accounts, a signature. Suddenly, the fortune isn't just exposed to one person's impulses, but two sets of them, multiplied by emotion and law. Lawsuits arrive next. Not because anyone did something wrong, necessarily, but because visibility invites pressure. I learned early that lawsuits aren't about truth when large sums are involved. They're about leverage, about exhaustion, about settlement math. If the assets sit in a personal name, the numbers start whispering. Pay this and it goes away. And sometimes, paying feels easier than fighting, even when it chips away at something that was meant to last longer than a lifetime. Taxes finish what impatience begins. I've watched heirs inherit things they never wanted to understand. Businesses, properties, shares, complicated structures built by someone else's obsession. Faced with complexity, they choose simplicity. They sell. Cash feels clean, honest, manageable. But the moment those assets are liquidated, something irreversible happens. The compounding engine stops. What remains looks large, but it's already shrinking, quietly bleeding through taxation and consumption. And then come the ego projects, the most seductive form of destruction. After enough time with money, accumulation loses its thrill. What replaces it is the desire to be seen, to build something visible, something impressive. I've seen fortunes poured into ideas that sounded ambitious, but were really just reflections of identity. No one wants to shut them down because they're personal. Losses are reframed as patience. Doubling down feels like conviction, until one day, the fortune exists only as a story. What ties all of this together is entitlement. The moment wealth becomes a right instead of a responsibility, it changes character. It stops being a machine and starts behaving like a wallet. And wallets are meant to be emptied. The critical mistake isn't spending, it's liquidation. That single decision, where productive assets are exchanged for cash, and the future is quietly mortgaged for present clarity. I began to notice that families who lasted didn't fight human nature. They designed around it. They understood that ownership, control, and benefit didn't need to live in the same place. In most families, they're fused together out of convenience or fairness. But fairness isn't a design principle. Survival is. When all three are handed to the same person, especially someone untested, the outcome is almost always the same. The families that endured treated inheritance like a system, not an event. Assets stayed where they were, inside structures that couldn't be sold on impulse. What passed down wasn't control, but access. Monthly distributions, approved expenses, education funded, homes maintained. The beneficiaries lived well, but the core remained untouched. They could enjoy the fruit, but the tree stayed standing. Trusts became the foundation, not as gifts, but as containers. The assets no longer belonged to any one person. Rules replaced moods. Trustees followed instructions written with distance and foresight. The most dangerous action, liquidation, was removed from the table entirely. It wasn't about mistrust. It was about acknowledging how permanent decisions collide with temporary emotions. Protections layered on top of that foundation. Clauses that made the wealth difficult to attack. If a beneficiary stumbled, the system didn't collapse. Lawsuits could circle, but the core stayed out of reach. The person might struggle, but the structure endured. I saw how this separation allowed compassion without vulnerability, support without surrender. Access was slowed deliberately. Nothing arrived all at once. Time became a filter. Mistakes made in one decade couldn't erase the next. Money released gradually, sometimes tied to age, sometimes to milestones, sometimes never fully at all. It wasn't generous or cruel. It was calibrated, designed with an understanding of how people change and how rarely they do it quickly. Incentives replaced assumptions. Income matched effort. Education unlocked resources. Support flowed to health, housing, and productive work, not indulgence. The system didn't care how someone felt about it. It responded only to behavior. Over time, this created a strange equilibrium. Beneficiaries weren't idle, but they weren't desperate either. The wealth remained in motion, but never at risk. Control stayed concentrated. Voting rights separated from cash flow. Profits distributed without surrendering decision-making. This solved the quiet problem of scale. Multiple heirs could benefit without fracturing authority. No one could sell the business out of boredom or insecurity. The machine stayed focused, insulated from the need for personal validation. Marriage was treated with clarity. Emotion acknowledged, law respected. Boundaries drawn early, not out of suspicion, but realism. Wealth stayed where it belonged, protected from dilution at moments when emotions ran highest and judgment ran lowest. Love was allowed to be love. Money remained money. Governance tied everything together. Rules written once, applied forever. Councils formed, risk defined, distributions limited, experts consulted. The family stopped behaving like individuals and started behaving like an institution. Chaos lost its entry points. Conflict had fewer places to land. The wealth became impersonal enough to survive personal flaws. What I came to understand is that heirs don't inherit money. They inherit proximity to a system. They live well, sometimes very well, but they never own the engine outright. It stays protected. Difficult to sell, difficult to waste, difficult to attack. Not because anyone was perfect, but because perfection was never required. When I think about wealth now, I don't think about numbers. I think about restraint. About the discipline of removing choices before they become temptations. About designing for the moments when judgment fails. The families that last aren't lucky. They're realistic. And they build as if someone, someday, will make a mistake. Because someone always does. Over time, I noticed something else that rarely gets said out loud. The structures weren't built because the founders distrusted their children. They were built because the founders understood themselves. They remembered their own impulses, their own moments of certainty that later revealed themselves as impatience. They knew how easy it is to confuse confidence with clarity, so they designed systems that would still function when emotions ran ahead of judgment, when urgency disguised itself as opportunity. What surprised me most was how impersonal the wealth eventually became. Not cold, but distant. It stopped reacting to individual moods. A bad year didn't trigger panic. A good year didn't invite excess. The system absorbed volatility the way a shoreline absorbs waves, reshaping nothing fundamental. People came and went, roles changed, personalities clashed, but the structure remained indifferent to all of it. That indifference I realized, was the point. I've seen heirs resent that distance at first. They mistake restriction for punishment. They feel underestimated, constrained, delayed. But with time, something subtle happens. The absence of absolute control removes a certain kind of pressure. Decisions no longer carry the weight of finality. Mistakes don't threaten annihilation. The future stays open. And slowly, the resentment gives way to something quieter. A recognition that not everything valuable needs to be personally owned to be deeply felt. The longer the system runs, the harder it becomes to pinpoint who it belongs to. It starts belonging more to time than to people. Generations interact with it briefly, like stewards passing through a long corridor. Each leaves fingerprints, none leave ownership. The wealth stops being a symbol of success and becomes more like infrastructure, unnoticed when it works, devastating when it fails, respected only after it's gone. And maybe that's the final shift that matters most. When wealth stops being something to prove and starts being something to preserve, the conversation changes. Not louder, quieter, more restrained. Decisions slow down. Ego loses its urgency. The future, once abstract, becomes present in every choice. And the system continues. Not because anyone demands it to, but because it was never designed to need permission in the first place.